The contractors stopped work because nobody could explain who actually controlled the road behind my farm. That was the part that felt wrong. The HOA had already built drainage lines, utility roads, and emergency access paths through the corridor years earlier. But suddenly the maintenance gate was chained shut with a new property management sign bolted onto it. One county map showed the road as shared access. The newer development maps didn't. By the time I drove to the archive office, even the contractors were asking whether the parcel records still matched the original easement filings. The answers kept changing depending on who we asked. And the utility crews had already started rerouting trucks across softer ground near the retention lines. The first time Daniel Mercer realized something was wrong, there wasn't an argument. There was just a utility truck sitting half sideways across the gravel shoulder near the east fence line, while two contractors stared at a locked steel gate that had never been locked before. Daniel noticed it because the truck was blocking one of the irrigation turnoffs he still used for the lower soybean strip behind his barn. He killed the engine on his old tractor and waited for one of the men to wave him around, but neither of them moved. One of them finally walked over. "You own this site?" he asked. Daniel looked past him toward the gate. Fresh HOA signage had been bolted onto the post sometime during the last week. Authorized access only Ridgecrest Property Management. That road's been used by county maintenance crews longer than your truck's been alive, Daniel said. The contractor gave an uncomfortable little shrug. "We got told not to cross private agricultural property without updated authorization." Daniel climbed down from the tractor slower than he normally would have. The gravel road behind the gate cut across the back edge of his farm before curving toward the retention ponds and utility trenches the HOA had installed during the second expansion phase. Half the development's drainage access crews used that corridor whenever the weather got bad enough. 3 nights earlier, a storm had washed out part of the trench line near the eastern subdivision entrance. Daniel knew because muddy runoff had carried insulation foam and plastic markers halfway into his lower field. He walked to the gate and looked at the new chain. "That from the board?" he asked. "Management company?" "That's different." The contractor didn't answer that. Daniel rested one hand against the cold steel and looked down the length of the road. Fresh tire marks disappeared toward the development behind the tree line. Somebody had clearly been using the corridor recently. They just didn't want anyone else using it now. That bothered him more than the lock itself. The younger contractor stepped closer. "Honestly, we thought this was HOA owned already." Daniel glanced at him. "You thought wrong." The man immediately looked like he regretted saying it out loud. Daniel didn't argue after that. That was the part people usually misunderstood about him. Residents inside Ridgecrest liked calling him stubborn because he never sounded particularly emotional when disagreements happened. But most of the time, he just went quiet and started checking whether something practical had changed without anybody noticing. By late afternoon, he was in the county archive office 30 minutes away, standing beside a humming scanner, while an exhausted clerk dragged out older transfer records tied to the original farmland subdivision sales from the late 90s. Most of the newer records had already been digitized. That was apparently the problem. The gravel corridor behind Daniel's farm appeared on older maintenance plats as a shared utility and emergency access road connected to the original acreage transfer agreements before Ridgecrest existed as an HOA at all. But the newer development maps simplified it into an internal service road. Daniel noticed the discrepancy almost immediately because the parcel line thicknesses didn't match. The clerk leaned over the counter. "You looking for an easement conflict?" "Not yet." That earned him a tired smile. Outside, daylight was already fading across the parking lot when Daniel spread copies of the plats across the hood of his truck. One version showed the corridor touching HOA utility access. The other pushed the line several feet inward toward his property boundary. Not much, but enough. Enough for somebody to stop replacing old paperwork with specific wording and start using cleaner digital summaries instead. His phone buzzed while he was comparing parcel numbers. The contractor from earlier. "You here yet?" the man asked quietly. "Hear what they just postponed the trench repair until legal clears access routing." Daniel looked back down at the plats on his hood. The storm damage wasn't severe enough to shut anything down yet. But another week of standing water near those trenches and the lower retention system would start backing up toward the unfinished homes near Phase 3. He folded the plots slower the second time he looked at them. Not panic, just the uncomfortable feeling that people inside Ridgecrest had started making decisions about land they no longer fully understood. He folded the plats carefully before answering. "Who told you to stop work?" There was a pause on the line. Then the contractor said quieter this time. "That's the weird part. Nobody seems completely sure." Daniel spent most of Thursday morning at the kitchen table with 3 different sets of plats spread beside a cold cup of coffee he kept forgetting to drink. The problem wasn't that the documents disagreed completely. It was that they disagreed carefully. The older county copies labeled the gravel corridor as a shared maintenance and emergency access easement tied to the original acreage transfer. The newer Ridgecrest development packet treated it like an internal HOA service route. Same road, same direction. Different authority language. Daniel circled the parcel references twice before noticing the renewal clause attached to one of the archived supplements. The wording was dense and older than most of the houses sitting behind his fields now, but the meaning underneath it wasn't hard to follow. Utility and emergency routing rights connected to the corridor weren't automatically transferable without recorded continuation agreements tied to the originating parcel. His parcel. Daniel leaned back in the chair and rubbed one hand across his jaw. He still didn't think the situation was catastrophic. Mostly because he couldn't imagine Ridgecrest building half its infrastructure around a corridor nobody had legally cleaned up. That would have been reckless. He scanned the supplement again anyway. Around noon, a white county pickup rolled slowly down the gravel road behind his barn before stopping near the locked gate. Daniel watched through the kitchen window while a drainage technician climbed out holding a clipboard. 10 minutes later, the man knocked on Daniel's front door. "You, Mercer?" Daniel nodded. The technician looked uncomfortable already. "You know, if there's another way into the east retention line, depends what you're driving." The man gave a tired laugh. "That bad?" Ground soft near the creek crossing. The technician glanced back toward the road. Management company told us this gate situation's temporary. It probably is. Probably. The technician shifted his weight. You know who actually controls the road? Daniel noticed the question came too quickly, like he'd already asked somebody else first and hadn't gotten a clear answer. That depends who's asking, Daniel said. The man stared at him for half a second, then lowered his voice slightly. Honestly, nobody at Ridgecrest sounds completely certain. That stayed with Daniel longer than he expected. By late afternoon, he drove into the development for the first time in weeks because he figured it would be easier to hand the documents directly to somebody before rumors started turning the whole thing sideways. The Ridgecrest office sat beside the clubhouse entrance behind decorative stone walls and fresh landscaping crews that still smelled faintly of fertilizer. 2 contractor trucks were parked near the side lot, but neither crew looked particularly busy. Inside, the receptionist recognized Daniel immediately, which surprised him. You hear about the access road, she asked before he said anything. So the problem had already started spreading. I'm trying to stop it from becoming one. She gave him the kind of smile people used when they didn't want responsibility attached to a conversation. Lauren Whitaker came out a few minutes later, holding a tablet against her side. Daniel had only spoken to her twice before. She looked younger than most board presidents he'd dealt with over the years, but she carried herself with the same polished certainty developers always seem to learn somewhere. Mr. Mercer, she said, I hear we've got some confusion over old maintenance routes. Daniel handed her the copied plats without sitting down. It's not confusion if the records disagree. Lauren skimmed the first page quickly. These older easement structures usually get absorbed during phased redevelopment. Usually. She looked up at him then. Daniel noticed she didn't actually answer the point. She just pivoted around it professionally. We've already asked legal to review the corridor language, she said. In the meantime, we'd appreciate residents avoiding interference with active utility work. Interference. The contractors mentioned you raised concerns on site yesterday. Daniel stared at her for a moment. Not angry yet. Mostly trying to decide whether she genuinely believed the problem was administrative paperwork, or whether she already understood something was off and simply didn't want the board hearing it publicly first. The trench repair got postponed, he said. Temporarily, because nobody knows who controls the access route. Lauren folded the plats closed. I think that's overstating things. Maybe it was. But when Daniel walked back outside, one of the contractor crews was standing beside the drainage trucks, arguing quietly over a printed site map spread across a tailgate. One of them tapped the gravel corridor with his finger, then crossed it out. By the beginning of the next week, Ridgecrest still hadn't reopened the gravel corridor behind Daniel's farm. That alone wouldn't have mattered much a month earlier. Most residents inside the development probably didn't even know the road existed. It sat behind tree cover and drainage embankments most people never had reason to drive near. The problem was that too many crews had started rerouting around it at the same time. Daniel noticed the first sign Tuesday morning when a pair of utility trucks chewed deep tracks across the softer county shoulder near the creek crossing, instead of using the maintenance corridor directly. One of the drivers got halfway stuck trying to reverse around a culvert pipe. The county workers looked irritated before they even climbed out. "You weren't kidding about the ground," one of them muttered. Daniel leaned against the fence rail while they worked the truck loose with plywood boards and a tow chain. Neither man mentioned the easement directly, but both kept glancing toward the locked Ridgecrest gate farther down the property line. Eventually, one of them asked, "You hear if legal settled that access mess yet?" "Not from me," Daniel said. The workers spit into the grass, whole thing slowing down inspections. That was new. Until then, Daniel still thought the disruption was mostly limited to contractors and scheduling delays. Inspections getting dragged into it meant county departments had started noticing inconsistencies too. By noon, temporary orange markers appeared along the emergency overflow route near Phase 3. Daniel drove past them slowly on his way into town and saw two Ridgecrest maintenance employees repositioning barricades beside an unfinished drainage trench. One of them recognized his truck immediately and stopped talking mid-sentence. The other kept speaking quietly until he realized nobody was answering him anymore. That reaction bothered Daniel more than open hostility would have. People inside Ridgecrest were starting to behave like the corridor issue carried consequences they didn't fully understand yet. At the feed store later that afternoon, a man Daniel vaguely recognized from one of the newer lakefront homes caught him near the fertilizer pallets. "You're the one with the access dispute, right?" Daniel adjusted the receipt in his hand. "That's what they're calling it now." The man looked embarrassed almost instantly. "I just heard they paused some infrastructure approvals over there. Who told you that my brother does concrete work for one of the subcontractors?" Daniel nodded once. The resident hesitated. "They saying emergency vehicles might have problems getting through certain sections if the county changes road approval." "That's not how emergency routing works," Daniel said automatically. But even while saying it, he knew the situation was already drifting into something bigger than paperwork confusion. Because emergency routing absolutely depended on approved access continuity during active development phases. The resident noticed Daniel stopped talking. "That bad?" Daniel folded the receipt carefully before sliding it into his jacket pocket. "I don't think anybody knows yet." When he got home, a white SUV was parked beside the gate at the edge of his property. Lauren Whitaker stood near the chain with a man in a blue county infrastructure vest holding several enlarged site maps against the hood of the vehicle. Neither looked particularly comfortable. Daniel climbed out of his truck. Lauren tried professionalism first. "Mr. Mercer, sorry to stop by unannounced." The county employee nodded politely but didn't introduce himself. Daniel noticed the maps immediately. Different colors, different route overlays, several sections highlighted in red marker. The county man finally spoke. "We're trying to verify emergency maintenance continuity for the eastern retention systems." Meaning, Lauren answered before he could. "It's procedural." Daniel looked at the maps again. One of the highlighted routes crossed directly through the gravel corridor behind his farm before reconnecting with the lower service roads near the unfinished expansion lots. Not one route. 3. He felt irritation give way to something heavier then. Not anger exactly, More like delayed disbelief settling into place piece by piece. Because nobody builds overlapping infrastructure routes through private agricultural land accidentally. The county employee shifted the map slightly. There's conflicting documentation tied to the secondary drainage access paths. Daniel looked toward the locked gate, still chained, still carrying the new Ridgecrest management signage. Behind it, farther down the road, a utility excavator sat idle beside standing water that should have been drained days ago. Lauren followed his line of sight. Then she asked much more carefully this time, "Do you happen to know when the original renewal agreement stopped being filed?" Daniel didn't answer Lauren's question right away. Mostly because he was still looking at the red road overlays spread across the SUV hood. 3 separate maintenance paths crossed his property boundary before reconnecting to Ridgecrest infrastructure farther downhill. One was tied to drainage overflow access. Another linked to utility servicing behind Phase 3. The last one ran along the emergency vehicle turnaround route near the retention basins. None of them looked temporary. The county employee shifted uncomfortably beside the maps. Some of these corridor references appear to originate from phased expansion revisions that reused the older access assumptions. Daniel glanced at him. That a polite way of saying, "Nobody checked the easements," Lauren answered first. "We're still reviewing documentation." The county man stayed quiet after that. Daniel noticed it immediately. People stopped correcting each other once liability entered the room. Wind pushed lightly through the trees near the ditch line while the excavator farther down the road remained idle beside the standing water. The machine hadn't moved since the previous afternoon. That bothered Daniel more now that he understood the overlap pattern. Infrastructure crews weren't waiting because the repairs were complicated. They were waiting because nobody wanted responsibility attached to the wrong route decision. Lauren finally closed one of the map folders. "Would you be willing to meet with legal later this week?" Daniel looked at the locked gate again before answering. "That depends whether they're trying to solve the problem or explain it smaller." Lauren's expression tightened slightly at that. Not anger. More like fatigue beginning to replace certainty. By Wednesday afternoon, Ridgecrest residents had started noticing the delays openly. The overflow ditch near Phase 3 still hadn't been cleared, and 2 unfinished sections of roadway remained lined with temporary barricades and portable drainage pumps. Daniel drove past them on his way back from town and noticed several homeowners standing near the edge of the construction area, watching workers reposition hoses around pooled water. Nobody looked panicked. Just irritated in the careful way people got when expansive neighborhoods stopped functioning as smoothly as promised. One woman recognized Daniel's truck and lowered her voice immediately while talking to another resident. That happened twice more before he reached the main exit road. The social atmosphere had shifted without anybody openly admitting it. Later that evening, Daniel sat across from 2 Ridgecrest attorneys and Lauren inside a conference room overlooking the golf course entrance. The room itself looked aggressively modern. Glass walls, brushed steel fixtures, digital planning displays cycling through expansion renderings on the far wall. The stack of old county plats sitting in front of Daniel looked almost out of place there. One of the attorneys slid a highlighted copy toward him. We believe portions of the original access language became functionally obsolete after redevelopment. Daniel read the paragraph once. Then again. They became ignored, he said. That's different. The younger attorney leaned forward slightly. Operational use continuity can sometimes supersede historical routing structures. Ken Daniel said. Didn't. Nobody answered immediately. Lauren flipped through another folder while the silence stretched longer than it probably should have. Daniel noticed she had started separating documents into categories now. Emergency routing, utility access, drainage servicing. Before this week, Ridgecrest had treated the corridor like one maintenance issue. Now they were realizing multiple systems touched it separately. Remove entirely and let surrounding operational details imply meaning. Not the gate, not even the easement itself. It was the fact that too many parts of the development had quietly grown around assumptions nobody formally verified. The older attorney eventually cleared his throat. We're trying to avoid unnecessary operational disruption. Daniel nodded once. So am I. That answer seemed to unsettle the room more than an argument would have. Because nobody there could fully tell whether he was protecting his land, protecting the development, or simply refusing to let people reduce the problem into paperwork wording anymore. When the meeting finally ended, Lauren walked with him toward the parking lot. For the first time since this started, she sounded less polished. Between you and me, she said quietly, I don't think the board understood how many systems were tied into those original corridor agreements. Daniel adjusted the folded plaits under his arm. You built around the roads before you understood who controlled them. Lauren looked back toward the building behind them, where lights still glowed through the conference room glass. Then she said something Daniel hadn't heard from anybody at Ridgecrest yet. We may have to delay Phase 4 approvals. Daniel watched the maintenance truck crawl slowly past the clubhouse entrance, carrying temporary drainage pipes sectioned in its bed. The driver turned toward the blocked corridor road automatically, then stopped halfway through the turn and backed out again. The temporary access signs showed up 2 days later. Daniel saw the first one while hauling feet toward the lower storage shed near the eastern fence line. A white metal post had been driven into the gravel shoulder beside the corridor road overnight. Authorized temporary emergency access pending infrastructure review. The wording itself wasn't important. What mattered was the small Ridgecrest operations sticker bolted underneath it. For the first time since the gate went up, the HOA had publicly acknowledged the corridor existed as something other than an internal surface road. Daniel parked the truck and stood there, a moment watching two maintenance vehicles move cautiously through the route behind the sign. Both trucks slowed automatically when they passed his property line, like the drivers still weren't entirely sure whether they belonged there. That uncertainty had started spreading everywhere now. Not dramatically. Quietly. Contractors double-checking route approvals before unloading equipment. County inspectors requesting written clarification instead of verbal confirmations. Residents asking maintenance crews questions they never would have cared about a month earlier. Even Ridgecrest traffic patterns had changed. People near Phase 3 kept avoiding sections of roadway closest to the unfinished drainage routes because temporary barriers and service equipment had started appearing there almost daily. Nothing had failed outright. But the development no longer felt fully stable. At the grocery store, people spoke to him differently than they had a week earlier. The woman who used to complain about his tractors slowing traffic near the Ridgecrest entrance stopped him beside the checkout lanes. "I heard they're revising the emergency routes now," she said carefully. Daniel adjusted the box of irrigation fittings under one arm. "Looks that way." She hesitated before speaking again. "People are saying the board should have checked the older records before they started the expansion." Daniel waited. The woman glanced toward the front windows like she regretted saying it publicly already. "Anyway, I guess you were right to raise concerns. It wasn't an apology. It sounded more like someone trying to reposition themselves before the situation settled permanently. That happened more often over the next several days. People changing tone without changing history." By Monday morning, Ridgecrest contractors had reopened limited access through the corridor under temporary county supervision. Orange survey paint marked new lane boundaries along the gravel route, while utility crews worked beside stacks of drainage pipe near the lower retention line. Daniel drove through slowly after one of the county employees waved him forward. The excavator that had been sitting idle for nearly a week was finally moving again. But the crews weren't working normally. Every vehicle entering the corridor now signed temporary routing paperwork at a folding table positioned beside the gate. One contractor spent nearly 10 minutes arguing quietly with a supervisor over which section of roadway counted as authorized maintenance access versus emergency overflow access. Same road. Different liability categories now. That was the part Ridgecrest hadn't expected. Once the easement issue became operationally visible, every overlapping assumption inside the development started separating into smaller legal questions. Daniel stepped out near the drainage trench while a utility foreman checked revised route maps against painted survey markers. The foreman recognized him immediately. "You hear if they settled the long-term agreements yet?" "Not officially." The man nodded toward the maintenance traffic moving through the corridor. "Feels weird needing temporary permission slips to use roads everybody thought belonged to the HOA already." Daniel looked down the line of trucks. They built fast. Too fast, Daniel didn't answer directly. Because the problem wasn't speed by itself. It was expansion happening on top of inherited systems nobody fully stopped to understand first. Near the gate, Lauren stood talking with two county reviewers beside a stack of revised infrastructure diagrams. She noticed Daniel and walked over after a moment. She looked more tired than she had during the earlier meetings. Not defensive anymore. Just strained. "We're drafting revised access agreements," she said. "The county wants emergency routing clarified before Phase 4 inspections continue." Daniel nodded once. Lauren glanced toward the crews moving through the corridor. "The board's asking whether you'd approve a long-term maintenance easement adjustment if the revised language recognizes the original corridor authority." Daniel folded his work gloves slowly into his back pocket. Around them, engines idled while contractors waited for routing approvals before crossing the lower access point. Nobody rushed anymore. That might have been the clearest sign the atmosphere inside Ridgecrest had actually changed. Not the legal meetings, not the delayed expansion schedules, the caution. The entire development had started moving like it finally understood the land underneath. It wasn't as simple as the maps had made it look. Daniel looked toward the unfinished Phase 4 grading area in the distance. Then back at the corridor cutting through his farm. "We should probably start with the routes everybody's already dependent on," he said. Lauren nodded immediately. Too quickly. Like she'd been waiting several days to hear somebody say the word depending out loud. By the middle of summer, the gate behind Daniel Mercer's farm was still there. The difference was that it stayed open now during maintenance hours. County-approved easement markers have been installed along the gravel corridor in evenly spaced intervals, each one stamped with revised routing codes tied to the updated emergency access agreements Ridgecrest finally signed after nearly 6 weeks of negotiations. The signs looked temporary at first glance, but the concrete footings underneath them weren't. Daniel noticed details like that automatically. Permanent decisions always looked temporary in the beginning. 2 utility trucks rolled slowly through the corridor, while Daniel repaired fencing near the southern pasture line one humid Thursday morning. Both vehicles stopped briefly beside the updated access checkpoint, where contractors now signed maintenance locks before crossing into the lower drainage sector. Nobody argued about the paperwork anymore. That part had settled. Mostly. The unfinished Phase 4 expansion still sat quiet beyond the retention ponds, though grading crews had returned to portions of the site after county reviewers approved revised infrastructure routing plans. Fresh survey stakes cut across the edge of the property where Ridgecrest engineers had redesigned portions of the drainage layout to reduce dependency overlap with the original farm corridor. Expensive fix. Slower too. Daniel doubted the board enjoyed explaining either one to investors. Around noon, Lauren pulled onto the shoulder near the access road in a dusty Ridgecrest operations SUV. She stepped out carrying a narrow document tube under one arm. "You were right about the southern runoff grading," she said without much introduction. The revised layout pushed too much water toward the lower culvert. Daniel kept tightening fence wire another few seconds before answering. "You corrected it. We're reworking that section next month." Daniel nodded once. Lauren stopped correcting him as often after the county review started. Less polished, less defensive, mostly practical. She handed him a finalized copy of the revised easement agreement before leaving. Daniel skimmed the pages briefly while standing beside the fence line. The language was cleaner this time. Shared emergency access, maintenance continuity, county review obligations. Recorded corridor authority attached permanently to the originating parcel. No vague assumptions left hiding underneath summary wording anymore. Farther down the road, a maintenance convoy slowed automatically before entering the corridor beside Daniel's pasture. One of the newer contractors lowered his speed enough to wave first before continuing through. Small thing. But Daniel noticed that too. People inside Ridgecrest still looked uncomfortable around him sometimes. Residents who used to treat the farm like leftover acreage from before the development existed now spoke more carefully whenever infrastructure work came up. Not friendlier, exactly. Just aware. Later that evening, Daniel carried the updated plats into the barn office and set them beside the older county copies he'd been using since 2015. since the gate first closed weeks earlier. The original parcel lines still matched. That was the strange part underneath all of it. Nothing about the land itself had changed, only the assumptions built around it. Outside, another pair of utility vehicles moved slowly through the corridor while the last light faded across the unfinished sections of Ridgecrest beyond the fields. Operations continued, just differently now. And farther east beyond the Phase 4 grading area, Daniel could already see county survey flags appearing near another neighboring property line where older access roads disappeared into tree cover nobody had paid much attention to before. The revised easement packet arrived in a thick county envelope 3 weeks after Ridgecrest approved the final infrastructure changes. Daniel left it unopened on the kitchen table most of the afternoon, while maintenance trucks moved steadily through the corridor behind his barn. The traffic no longer stopped at the gate for verbal approval now. Contractors checked in at the new county log station, signed the routing sheets, and kept moving toward the lower drainage sector, like the process had always existed. It hadn't. Residents stopped arguing about the corridor after the county routing signs went up. A few residents waved now when they passed Daniel near the roadside fencing. Others avoided looking toward the farm entirely whenever infrastructure crews were nearby. Nobody argued about the corridor anymore, though. The revised access markers and emergency routing signs made the dependency difficult to ignore publicly. Late that evening, Lauren stopped by long enough to drop off an updated drainage map with the corrected corridor overlays finally attached to the official development plans. She looked tired. Not defensive. Just finished with pretending the old assumptions still worked. Daniel set the revised map beside the older plats already stacked in the barn office. The original parcel lines still matched perfectly across every version. Outside, another utility convoy slowed automatically before crossing the easement road. The county routing stickers were already peeling at the corners.